All right, let's resume since we're so far behind schedule now. All right, so in a tradition that was started a few years ago, I've been asked to give a president's report on the history of the left and how it relates to our current activities in Platypus. And so I think the very first such report that I gave was on the legacy of the 1970s left. Then subsequently I gave a report on the century of Marxism, 1873 to 1973. And this year I'm giving a report on the legacy of the 1980s left for today, because it bears upon our activities increasingly moving forward. So hopefully we won't let this go very long. I just have a few minutes of comments to present, and then we can have a discussion, a short discussion. And some of the issues that came up in the plenary will be reprised here in slightly different form. The 1980s were a time in which the New Left hunkered down for a march through the institutions. After the failure of the countercultural revolution in 1968 and the economic crisis of the 1970s to transform society in emancipatory directions. These institutions included both academic higher education and the labor movement, as well as other civil society non-governmental organizations, so-called. In some cases, it also meant joining the mainstream political parties, attempting to transform them from within. What this meant was a disintegration of the left into two things: activism, attempting to be the most militant participants in, and thus leadership of, or at least a left pole of attraction for, various social and political movements. And two, academicism, attempting to reproduce and perpetuate the radicalization of students through posing and participating in higher education as a permanent counterculture. Right, so after the 60s, because of the student revolts of the 60s, then that generation joined academia to try to sort of make academia a permanent counterculture. And you see that all the way to the present. The former, as well as the latter, however, meant the institutionalization of the left, but not as a form of political organization, so much as a permanently organized anti-politics. An institutionalization of the liquidation of politics that had already taken place prior to the 1960s. What C. Wright Mills, among others, had decried as the death of ideology. Adorno warned of the brutal practicism and the instrumentalization of theory, what he considered the long playing out of the aftermath of the 1930s to 40s, in terms that were similar to Mills. After the 1980s, this has become wholly naturalized, almost entirely invisible to later generations. Indeed, it is only visible, as it had been already to Mills and Adorno in the 50s and 60s, by contrasting the present with history. Where Mills, no less than Adorno, clearly discerned the missing element in terms of Marx, Lenin, and Luxemburg, our present further distance means that we cannot clearly discern this phenomenon as even a liberal like Mills could, and not only Marxists such as Adorno did. This says something of the liquidation of liberalism too, and not merely of Marxism, in the history leading to our present moment. So the liberal vocations of both civic activism and education, both non-state phenomena of the bourgeois public sphere, stand in serious doubt today. The neoliberal era has been decidedly illiberal and not merely anti-Marxist in precisely these domains. University education evinces this especially. What Clement Greenberg, in the 1930s had already warned about the Alexandrianism that was besetting culture, has been underway for some considerable time now. In recent discussion on our members list, for example, in Platypus, Spencer pointed out the collapse of university education already visible in Hegel's time, in fact, and certainly for Marx already. In other words, why Marx couldn't get a university appointment. The medieval institution with its guild structure cannot revert unscathed after bourgeois emancipation, but must be less than it was before. The postmodernist wish for perpetual medievalism, that we were never modern, is a vain one. Any left must face the barbarism of our time. The 1980s has contributed to our blindness to this, naturalizing barbarism in ways that must be overcome. But first they must be recognized. What was clear already to Adorno in the 1940s as the racketeering of the labor movement can be said of all vestigial civil society institutions. What shocked and outraged the 1960s generation about the collusion of civil society in the politics of the state during the Cold War is now a matter of course. A curious reversal has thus taken place. Whereas once the demand from the 60s through the 80s was to assert the independence of institutions of higher education, for example, from the state, or of labor unions, from war policy, now it appears that activists attempt to influence state politics through contesting civil society. In other words, there was a time where civil society institutions were apparently being colonized by the state, and there was a protest against that. Now the idea is that we're going to change state policy by contesting civil society institutions. One sees this in the current BDS campaign against Israel, for example, which is a direct descendant of 1980s activism, such as anti-apartheid solidarity campaigns. In other words, you get divestment of universities from corporations that have stock in South Africa as a way of contesting politics. And this carries over in the present in the BDS campaign against Israel. This is rather hopeless, of course. For what was once regarded as an unfortunate compromise owing to prevailing right-wing conditions, and was hence considered temporary, in other words, the collusion of universities and war policy during the Cold War in the 60s, has become the only imaginable possible politics. In other words, today, activists, student activists, what's the first thing that they think of doing? They think of challenging university institutions. They don't think of what can we do at our university, organize the workers at our university, etc., as a way of affecting the larger society. And this is conceived as a permanent condition. Academic leftism has rendered not only the academic supposedly left, but has made the left academic, in both senses of the term. Ideology is entirely superfluous, and so what Mills warned about the end of ideology, being the end of politics, has only come true in ways he could have scarcely imagined himself. The New Left didn't reverse this trend, as Mills may have hoped, but rather institutionalized it. So on the one hand, for example, I'll just raise this, the university is a permanent counterculture in society, where it's been turned into this permanent campaign of the left, the university culture. On the other hand, academic inquiry and research is supposed to be non-ideological. It's supposed to be utterly non-ideological in a way that people in the 50s and 60s would have considered it to be impossible for that to be the case. Right, so we have this kind of schizophrenia where academia is a permanent counterculture, but it's supposed to be non-ideological in a way that hitherto no preceding generations of academics would have ever assumed that academia could have been so non-ideological. The labor movement, another side of this institutionalization and march through the institutions, the labor movement itself has long been condemned to acting merely in its own self-interest as a form of social corporatism. It is almost entirely on the defensive in its struggles in the last 4 decades. And this permanent defense campaign has contributed to the sense in the larger society that the labor movement only acts in its own self-interest. So what happened in the 1980s that has led to the present impasse? In other words, what took place in the 1980s that contributed to this naturalization of this trend? Not only did 1968 not bring revolution, but brought Nixon instead, so the 1970s did not bring about the deepening radicalization of society, owing to the crisis of both the counterculture and the economy, but rather brought about Reagan and Thatcher. Elsewhere, where it appeared to issue into an institutionalization of the left, it actually brought about a more obscure and hence pernicious right-wing development. For instance, Mitterrand's Socialist Party in France in the 1980s, in which many new leftists joined up. In the US, many former new leftists joined up in the Democratic Party, and actually a good number of them also joined the Republican Party. For instance, Eldridge Cleaver, Black Panther Party. And not only him. Also seeking to ostensibly transform it from within. They did transform the Democratic Party from within, and the Republican Party from within, and the Socialist Party in France from within. But they did so as a function of neoliberalism. Not the resistance to it that they themselves had imagined it to be, but rather through multiculturalism, etc., updating the long-standing ethnic political machine racket of the Democratic Party, for example.
The Republicans will catch up.
The Republicans will catch up, yes, the Republicans will catch up. The second Cold War of the 1980s was experienced by the 1960s generation as a return of McCarthyism, back to the 50s. But this allibied their own adaptation to prevailing society, their own right-wing tendencies. Already by 1979, the post-60s left had adapted to the right in significant and today well-entrenched ways. Support for the Islamic Revolution in Iran, as well as opposition to the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan as cause célèbre of the time, was accompanied by less stark representations of the politically right-wing tendencies, such as the support for African nationalism in the anti-apartheid struggle, today cruelly exposed for what it was, not only with Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, but in South Africa itself. And indeed, in the Central American Solidarity movement facilitated by enthusiasm for liberation theology. It's also a circa 1980s phenomenon. Those coming of age, according to the left in the 1980s, faced an academic as well as political culture well defined by two figures that had started out as contrasting each other in the late 60s and early 70s, Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault. It was a famous debate between Chomsky and Foucault. The 1980s rather reconciled them. In other words, it wasn't Chomsky or Foucault, it was rather Chomsky plus Foucault. It's a curious reversal that took place. And the 1980s reconciled them not in terms of their own thought, but rather in their reception, as an ideolated version of a kind of sub-anarchism, as well as a taste for the abject suffering, united them in the imagination of the 1980s. But in academic and bohemian intellectual culture, today, it has gone far beyond these venerable standard bearers. Indeed, it only gets worse, with Giorgio Agamben's Homo Sacer and the collapse of Althusserian materialism into Badiou's anarchic equality and neo-scholastic ontology, and a second wind for Deleuze's Spinozism, etc. What would have been ruled as far afoul of Marxism in any form previously, by the 1980s had become incorporated into ostensible Marxism itself, both for activists as well as for academics. In other words, that this kind of prevailing ethos is not just an academic thing, but it's also what activists themselves read and understand their own activity to be part of. This was not merely a matter of intellectual currents, however, but of practical politics as well. The model for activism in the 1980s derived from the 1960s, and involved both neglecting and naturalizing developments of the 1970s. Two different phases of reaction and retreat contributed to this. The failure of 1968, signaled by the election of Nixon, and the Reagan-Thatcher reaction and reinvigorated Second Cold War at the end of the 1970s, which, however, had already been begun under Carter. But the lessons learned were biased in favor of a positive evaluation of the 60s. Where the 1970s failed, the 1960s seemed to have succeeded. A nostalgia for youth and selective amnesia about failed attempts of young adulthood played a role in this, but it's not fully attributable to that phenomenon. meaning that after the 70s, the people who had lived through the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, they sort of conveniently forgot everything they tried to do in their 20s, like most people do, and rather remembered their more fond sort of adolescent ingenuousness. What appeared to have succeeded were the civil rights movement and the Vietnam anti-war movement. This apparent success, however, buried the crises of both. In other words, both of these experienced a crisis. The turn to Leninism in the 1970s was abandoned by most participants of the left in embarrassment, leaving only a hard core to carry on the standard in the 1980s. By 1980, the left was utterly decimated in terms of numbers. However, that term decimation is misleading because it was not that 1 in 10 was culled, but probably not even 1 in 10 were remaining standing after 1980. There were hundreds of thousands of leftists in the 70s and a couple of thousand leftists in the 80s. Those who remained on the left in the 80s remained the only custodians of the preceding history, therefore. And they abused their role, abdicating their responsibility to history. Recognition of failure was repressed. Instead, it was the struggle continues. Both the academicized and die-hard activist leftists thus became responsible for the miseducation of those who followed. Whatever didn't fit in with their pat and pseudo-triumphalist account, in the victory of the 60s, that the struggle continues, a stalwart trope, by the way, of Stalinism descended from the 1930s. Whatever didn't fit that narrative was left to utter neglect and oblivion. Though both Frankfurt School critical theory and Trotskyism, as disintegrated remnants of prior Marxism, experienced something of a renaissance in the 1970s, by the 1980s they were abandoned as dynamic phenomena and became merely museum pieces of the history of the left and of Marxism. It is thus significant that figures that I raised earlier, Moishe Postone and Adolf Reed, both influenced deeply by the Frankfurt School, have no greater pejorative for the dead left than Trotskyism. It's one thing that unites them. They're both deep Trotskyists. What they mean by this are the cranky sectarians who await the unwary activists. But the attempt to preserve Marxism intellectually, even by the most theoretically and politically principled of academic leftists, has clearly failed. Postone and Reed have no student successors at all. Their only potential student successors are Platypus. Only Platypus can claim their pedagogy at a political level, and therefore at an intellectual level, and nonetheless we must alter it significantly to give it any potential purchase in the present and the future. It's also significant that although Postone and Reed are generationally of the cohort of the 60s, as academics, they're really products of the 1980s academic culture. In other words, they sort of spent the 70s kind of studying and doing activism, and then they really only joined academia in the 80s. They kind of joined academia late. The 1980s generation and its selective canonization and amnesia of the problems of the 1960s new left, the unovercome, untranscended horizons of the crisis of the 60s, will be the actual gravediggers of the left and of Marxism and its history that the new left had only wished to be. Right? In other words, whereas the new left, the 60s new left, had engaged in an Oedipal struggle against the old left and against the history of the left and against Marxism, they didn't actually bury it, but rather had to sort of conjure it forth in order to struggle with it in a way that the 80s generation, in its canonization and selective amnesia about the 60s, will actually bury the earlier history. That is, if Platypus doesn't prevent it. So like I said, that does repeat some thematics from the earlier discussion, but maybe with a different emphasis. And so let's just have like 10 minutes of discussion of this. Gregor.
I just have a three-part question, but I'm going to keep it short. One of these essential texts in Platypus is Postone's History and Helplessness. And he lays out a pretty good case that a lot of the left in the anti-war movement basically continued the dualism of the Cold War. I guess what I'm asking is, how you would apply that to the contemporary condition of the left, if you could just speak to that and the meaning of Stone's intervention on that. The second, that's mostly just a comment. I think the academic left is really authoritarian whilst trying to be anti-authoritarian, whilst trying to be an actual popular bottom-up grassroots movement in a way that it can't be because it limits itself so much to that sphere. And that's an irony that seems to me completely lost on what's come after the 80s. And my last question, I just wonder what specific point there is in your report about the inheritance of 80s leftism, pseudo-leftism, that isn't in a way commonsensical to the membership here. Mm-hmm. I mean, what could it add to the critique that many of us share already?
All right, let me just deal with that quickly. So I think it's significant. Well, Stone's essay, History and Helplessness, was actually a key document in the origins of Platypus. It was one of the first things that I had my students at the Art Institute read extracurricularly, like in other words, outside of class. I said, well, you can read this, send it to people as a PDF. I think it was before it was published. I had the manuscript as a PDF and sent it to people. And I think that was maybe December 2005, before it came out in early 2006. And it's interesting that in that piece, Stone actually uses the anti-apartheid struggle as well as Central American solidarity, as well as reaching further back to the Vietnam anti-war movement to draw a contrast. He said, well, look, the conditions in Vietnam, certainly conditions in Latin America with the right-wing dictatorship and the death squads, conditions in South Africa with apartheid, could have plausibly called forth terrorism, right? And yet it didn't, because it would have been invidious to the strategic aims of these movements. Right? So he's making a comparison between Al-Qaeda on the one hand, and probably to a certain degree the Second Intifada, and the earlier activism of the 80s. It's interesting that he brought up the civil rights examples, as well as going further back into the 60s. It goes to something that we were talking about earlier, and this to get to your third question, then I'll deal with the second question, which is that the 80s are actually not very different from the 60s. Right? In other words, that there are phases of the new left, and the sort of high new left is the 60s and 70s, and what I was trying to emphasize was how the 80s were the institutionalization of the new left, whereas the 60s and 70s were periods of radicalization, different phases of radicalization. There was a kind of a post-Marxist phase and then a neo-Marxist phase, 60s and 70s, a kind of anti-Leninist phase and a neo-Leninist phase, a kind of anarchist phase and then a Maoist phase.
One way of looking at it, 68 to 89 represents a long 70s.
Long 60s.
Or long 60s, and that has different phases, of which the 80s are the last phase.
That's right. And so one of the reasons why I'm arguing for treating the 80s not so differently from the 60s is that all of the 80s were, as a decade, was the kind of diminution and institutionalization and naturalization of the 60s. So, we could maybe trouble that a bit, but that's what's informing my approach. I think that the key decades to deal with are the 60s and 70s. I don't think that the 80s adds much. It adds something, but it doesn't add much. And what it adds is what we call academicism and activism. So to get to your point about authoritarian anti-authoritarianism, you mentioned that academic leftism is this authoritarian anti-authoritarianism, but so is activism. And in some ways, activism is more so than academicism, or maybe they're equally so, but in different ways. And they feed off each other. In other words, there's a kind of disavowal of pedagogical authority in the academic world. There's a kind of post-New Left claim to be carrying on education in a non-hierarchical manner that's actually deeply authoritarian. And that institutional character is not something that you can trace, like it's not like the teachings of the 60s are authoritarian anti-authoritarianism. It's not like moving the classroom into Berkeley Square or something, that was the essential move, that you really see it coming into its own in the 80s, I would argue. This kind of, you know, you're still in the traditional classroom, but the teacher disclaims any intention to educate. Right? That's not what was happening in the 60s. And what was happening in the 60s was the students were asking the teachers, teach us about Vietnam, and the teachers, as good liberals, were like, okay, I'll teach you about Vietnam. Right? You know, because I have something to tell you that you don't already know. In the 80s, there's a shift in which the idea is, well, we don't, you know, teachers don't really have anything to teach the students, etc. James,
I mean, I think that, in a sense, my problem is that there's a big hole in this account throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s thing, which is the 80s, which is actually the old left, which quote unquote, which didn't go away and was far more closely imbricated with the new left than perhaps you're making out. I mean, the 1980s, you know, obviously you can do it as a sense of activism and all these sort of the kind of the rise of like Cutrone and things like that. But actually, these things are partly the product of the decomposition of official communism, particularly more in Europe. I mean, in the US, I see the USA seems to just be pretty much the same fucking ginger grip on the Democrats forever. But in Britain, for instance, is the period where everyone like loves Gramsci, and it becomes sort of more feministy in sort of quite damaging ways. So this the sort of academicisation and then the kind of retreat of in that sense the harder left into kind of mindless activism seems to be that process that's actually the fundamental material kind of broader institutional problems going on is that firstly the second Cold War isn't a Cold War, it's a cold punishment beating. The USSR is about to die and is clearly about to die. But also the parties that are kind of imbricated with that pulling apart and just disintegrating. So I think that's the key process of disintegration. So the institutional process, which sustained labour activism in the 70s, especially in Britain and in France, Italy, is just kind of falling apart. I think in a sense like Trotskyism is already suffering badly because it had a serious and sustained crisis of perspectives starting in after the war.
No, I take your point. I do take your point because, in fact, that is missing from my account. In the sense that, and in the United States, the CP did play a role in the New Left. For instance, Angela Davis joined the CP, not accidentally, and a lot of New Left activists went into a CP-ish orbit. If we characterize right, but I think James is trying to characterize it. The SWP in the United States is old left. Obviously, it's a 30s formation. Trotskyism. There's new left Trotskyism and old left Trotskyism, and new left Trotskyism would be like the Cliffites, and old left Trotskyism would be the SWP. But maybe then the point would be recognizing how the 80s still embodies the Popular Front. Right? And so certainly Central American solidarity, South African solidarity, is Popular Front politics, definitely. What I'd argue is that Popular Front politics, and maybe in some ways this is different, although I'd say that there are important expressions of this in the United States as well, and I'm actually less familiar with the role of official communism in the British labor movement, like I really don't know anything about that. I think of like 70s laborism as like a new left, kind of multicultural like laborism.
That all came out of the CP. Basically.
Oh, it came out of...
Yeah, it was the Euro-communism.
Oh, so I didn't realize that. Okay, so that's definitely a hole in my knowledge. I thought that sort of came more strictly new lefty, like Stuart Hall, like that kind of scene.
Yeah, but these people were in the orbit of CP.
Ah, okay, all right, now that makes sense. So Popular Front politics, I mean, what I was going to say about the United States, about activism, and how the whole notion of activism is transformed in this period, also affects the labor movement. Right? In other words, if there's a crisis of the labor movement starting in the 70s, that is institutionally naturalized by the 1980s. So the degree to which again, the New Left generation does a march through the institutions, like first disdains of the labor movement and then joins the labor movement and tries to transform it from within, that they actually provide the ideological rationalization for the permanent defensive position of the labor movement once they join up. That the militancy of the 70s fades into this defensive struggle and that it's mediated through a kind of New Left consciousness. And I would say that that popular front imagination does play a role there. Like, I think that that is the sort of long history. I mean, what we would say is that the New Left never overcame the Old Left with respect to the popular front imagination. That what they did was update the popular front imagination rather than overcome it.
Yeah, first of all, I thought, Gregor, your response of what here is not obvious is interesting. Because I actually was the person who pushed this to the 80s. And the reason I pushed for it was that I thought that one had to look at what was obvious and the background for what we're stuck in to think about it. So in other words,
Objectify it in some way.
right, to objectify and to create a sense of critical distance. So I think that that's somewhat of the motivation. The other thing is, I mean, in response to James, I think that the United States in some respects represents an ideal type of a universal social transformation. And that while there are differences between the United States and Europe, in some ways Europe being behind the general curve because
Europe's
of the
catching up with the United States.
greater, right? And so I think that the overall framework, the third point I want to make, and this goes into the specific one, is in a way, you know, there was this trinity of dates, 79, 89, 99. 99 was mentioned in Seattle. But 79 and 89 represent two different aspects of the memory of how the left, how the 80s are conceived. I mentioned the significance of 1989, which is an old left conception of the centrality of the Soviet Union. Now, in the dominant left narrative of the 80s, the turning point is really earlier. It's the late 70s, early 80s. It's Thatcher, Reagan, it's neoliberalism, right? So, and I mean, when you said like everybody in the 80s viewed the Soviet Union as on its legs, I mean, this is like a weird artifact of memory that all across the ideological spectrum, somehow people have managed to convince themselves that people sort of anticipated the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think very few people anywhere in the ideological spectrum really.
That might be our own generational blindness, though, Richard, because
Well, Richard Nixon did. He was right.
Kissinger.
And Kissinger. But like in general, I think.
Well, Gorbachev is later, though. But the real question is, what did the Soviet Union look like from the standpoint of Yuri Andropov or something like
Right,
that?
but okay, but what I'm saying in terms of the question of memory, and this goes to another point which I would like Chris to add. One of the things that, in terms of the history of the old left, that I think has to be distinguished is that Maoism, as a phenomenon of the new left, facilitated this 80s orientation much more than Trotskyism. There's a way in which Trotskyism, which informed a mid-century consciousness, was peculiarly ill-adapted to a late 20th century. So Trotskyists would sort of adapt themselves in ways to the new left, often unsuccessfully. Maoism was largely a product of the new left. It was the new
more
left
successful.
becoming serious. And even though Maoism in its official form disappeared first, a kind of Maoist influence sensibility, and a lot of people have done a lot of scholarship on this, I think influenced the 80s much more than has been given credit. And I think that's true in Europe too. And I think that the point about Foucault and Chomsky is really interesting because
Did the Maoists join Mitterrand's Socialist Party?
some did.
Trotskyists did.
I mean, people all over the spectrum did. But I think that the question is like, why did Foucault and Chomsky coexist in a certain culture? Because, and the reason is that on the one hand, they offered opposite things. They offered, they offered both a retreat from Marx without seeming to be unradical. Foucault offered what seemed to be a radical critique not merely of society, but of sort of all knowledge and regimes of knowledge, in other words. And Chomsky, on the other hand, is almost the opposite. It's sort of this apparent, very simplified, old-fashioned Enlightenment rationalism. And one of the peculiar themes that you find in terms of sort of the academic left is its highly ambivalent relationship to the problem of the Enlightenment rationality. So coming out of the 60s, you get, at sort of more rarefied discourse, this suspicion and hostility to the Enlightenment. But it's not a suspicion and hostility to the Enlightenment that could articulate itself in simply the direct, old-fashioned form of a classic European right-wing Enlightenment. So the paradox that Heidegger is embraced by people who largely consider themselves liberals or on the left. It's not American conservatives who embraced Heidegger, who was obviously a deeply right-wing thinker by any ordinary rational standard. It's people who think of themselves as liberals on the left. And that's a phenomenon that only would have been possible after the 60s. Right?
Right.
It would not have happened in the 40s and 50s that liberals would have embraced Heidegger. And,
Arendt.
well, Arendt, but she was German.
Nice. No, let me just say something about postmodernism. I left postmodernism out of account because I think that postmodernism both is and is not a phenomenon of the left. Meaning, I would, for the purposes of what I'm trying to present, differentiate academic leftism from postmodernism, even though they tend to collude. Because I think that Foucault is some kind of Heideggerian, opinionist, but he's not just that, in the way that, I don't know, Derrida might just be that. And so I was emphasizing something a little bit different. I was leaving aside the question of postmodernism, because really then one would have to get into the counterculture. In other words, how much was the 60s counterculture kind of right-wing? How much of the 60s counterculture was already Heideggerian in that respect? I'm leaving that aside. Rather, I'm thinking of what we're dealing with students, right? This is like a Platypus perspectives kind of talk rather than a global talk about the 80s, because we can talk about all sorts of things about the 80s. But in terms of what we deal with, in terms of our engagements on the left, part of the nature of our project, because we're operating on campuses, is that we're dealing with institutionalized left. In the sense that the leftists who are institutionalized by becoming professors, rather than institutionalized in the sense of Jack Nicholson and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Although, obviously there's some similarity. And in that respect, right, people have adopted postmodernism and Heideggerian postmodernism as part of this counterculture radicalism on campus, like this idea that that somehow radical values are being preserved in academic institutions. And that's something that we have to encounter. In other words, when we encounter pseudo-radicalism, it takes a peculiar form in terms of academia being rendered a permanent counterculture. And this is a peculiar thing that you guys are largely unaware of. But in the 80s, there was a hue and cry on the right. There was Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind. Right? There was a hue and cry about this move by the left to join academia. And so there was an attempt, an unsuccessful attempt, it should be pointed out. There was an attempt to carry out a McCarthyite, witch hunt and purge of academia in the 80s. In other words, once Reagan was elected, the idea was, well, Reagan, when he was governor of California, he went after Marcuse and Angela Davis. And so now that he's president, can't we go after all these academic leftists? It didn't happen. But there was a hue and cry about it. And all that means is that it was once noticeable, right? It was once noticeable that academia had been taken over by these hippies. Now it's not noticeable, right? Because we just take it for granted. And of course, academia is a leftist institution, or it's a liberal-ish institution. That would never have been considered the case prior to the 60s, but also not prior to the 80s. Like in the 70s, academia would not yet have been taken for granted to be a leftish space. It would have been a site of contestation, but it would have been a space that would have been assumed to be controlled by the Cold War state. In the 80s, the idea is, no, it's asserted its independence from the Cold War state.
Can I follow up one point you made, which is you made the point about, like in the 80s, the apparent victory and crisis of the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement. And I think one of the things that is interesting in terms of the trajectory of those two is that on the one hand, now we live in the age of Obama as president. So in some sense, the civil rights movement, not in terms of overall social equality, but in terms of formal structures of discrimination, has to be seen as victorious. Whereas we also live in the age of permanent warfare, third world wars, with like effectively no peace movement that has any grasp, and people just take that for granted. And I think that trajectory was still not obvious in the 80s. And I think that one of the things that has happened is that many of the social liberal aspects of the 60s have become increasingly naturalized. I mean, you know, it's sort of like, you think about things like gay marriage, which wasn't even really on the radar in the 80s, and now it's like on the verge of becoming completely natural. So I think that there was still like a sense of sort of the counterculture or certain type of liberal social values. I mean, even the discourse around race, I'm thinking about like the late 80s, early 90s, like Crown Heights, you know, rap music bursting on the scene. I think that there was still like some sense that certain values were in conflict in ways that certain problems have been naturalized and shifted.
Definitely, definitely. So Ben and Dario.
Sorry, I missed the report because I was working on something for our internal meeting, so forgive me if I'm kind of covering stuff that's already been spoken about. But I wanted to ask, well, two questions. I mean, this kind of entry of the kind of new left into the naturalization of the new left into the academy, the degree to which that's a kind of 80s exclusive phenomenon, if it's not really happening also in the 70s in the form of like black studies programs and women's studies programs and the kind of like new social movements of the 60s kind of becoming, you know, taking up a kind of barracks in the academy. I mean, you think of like Rustin's kind of, you know, confrontation with that very issue. I think
Already in the 60s.
Already in the late 60s. And how much that like kind of critique of Rustin would be really, you know, still pertinent in the way that the kind of, you know, the academy becomes a kind of, you know, natural environment for the new left in the 80s.
This is what I'd say about that. I'd say that in the 60s and 70s there was a demand that there be a place on campus, right, for these things. Whereas in the 80s, the transition was made to not there being a place on campus, but rather this was what the campus was. Yeah.
So
which is different.
the second part of the question that I had was the extent to which this is a kind of phenomena that's being heralded in the United States, or is happening kind of more or less exclusively in the United States, or happening simultaneously in Europe and elsewhere. I mean, clearly, you know, at the International Convention, the degree to which we're addressing this as a kind of issue that the membership is confronted with in even present circumstances, how much is that also translated into our kind of expansion in the efforts in Europe, and do we know kind of the terrain there as far as the way the left has kind of become
I think
habituated?
generally speaking, the
Yeah.
80s might be tricky in that respect. I think that the 60s and 70s are international. I think that they're a cosmopolitan phase of history. Again, this kind of neo-Marxism, neo-Leninism is international in the 70s. Now, the 80s are a lesser phenomenon. I think that the reason that we have to deal with the 80s is that we're just being presented with it increasingly. In other words, the 60s and 70s generation is literally fading out. And so we're not confronting it as much. And we will be confronting increasingly the 80s generation, but they won't confront us in the same way as the 60s and 70s generation. In other words, it is a lesser phenomenon. And I raised this earlier. I think it's a challenge to our project when we're left with sort of an 80s condition to work with as our historical backdrop, as opposed to a 60s and 70s condition to deal with as our backdrop. And I think that that is, I mean, maybe there is a default American-centric perspective to what I'm saying, but that's why I thought, you know, about, you know, something like, okay, where was neoliberalism supposedly not triumphant? Like Mitterrand's France, but it was. Like there was, it was a form of neoliberalism. even though it was seen as like departing from.
It just seems like there's a kind of interesting difference in that, whereas in the United States, the kind of radicalism moves into the academy and becomes kind of sets up camp and becomes naturalized there.
That's true in the 80s in France too. Yeah.
But in Europe, there's also a way in which that generation moves into like parliamentary politics. Like you get like a Daniel Cohn-Bendit type, like that. There's a kind
Here
of
too, Bobby Rush.
I mean, can I follow up? I think maybe the more interesting connection, just
Go
really,
ahead, yeah.
maybe the more interesting connection is why so many European theorists are the way that people here. I mean, you mentioned Chomsky is maybe the one American figure. Pretty much everyone else in the academy is, you know,
French fries.
Yeah, exactly. and so why the 60s and 70s French theorists and themselves living into the 80s, 90s, most of them, like why that becomes so hegemonic in the academic self-understanding.
Well, that's a funny thing because it's mediated through Britain too. In other words, it's not just a direct. There is a funny like Anglophone character translation of the French left, and it's mediated. I mean, that has to do with the New Left. That has to do with Paris '68. It has to do with again, it goes back to the '60s. You know, why are the theorists of academic leftism the French? Yeah, that's a sort of a deeper question, and that has to do with Paris, May '68. And I mean, what I'd say just straight away, because I was thinking about this in terms of like the whole question of being revolutionary and all of this, that because I was talking about this during the break, but only because I was thinking about it prior to giving my talk, which is the '60s is a missed opportunity. Like we talked about this a little bit in the plenary session. But the '60s really were a missed opportunity. And so in what way were they a missed opportunity? There was a crisis, first of all, of the Keynesian Fordist or Fordist-Keynesian state that manifested by the late '60s. That's a deeply obscure issue. It's not something that simply erupts in the '73 crisis, a global economic crisis, but there's already a kind of a cultural and political expression of the crisis of Keynesian Fordism or Fordist-Keynesianism in the '60s. And what I wanted to say specifically about 60s, 70s, 80s, May '68 in France, like we have to bend the stick the other way or kind of argue against the doxa of '68, but it was a crisis of the French state. There was almost a revolution in an advanced capitalist country in France in 1968. Of course, when the New Left generation says that, we have to say, not really, because it's like self-serving on their part. But honestly, of course there was. Now, in the United States, we need to beat back their illusions, but not at the expense of the truth, right? In the United States, the civil rights movement itself, and the Vietnam War as a debacle. In other words, the Vietnam War was not a successful replay of the Korean War containment or of the suppression of the Malaysian insurgency by the British in the same period. These were potentially revolutionary crises. In other words, the Vietnam War could have undermined the U.S. state. It could have. And the civil rights movement certainly could have undermined American politics. And it was a crisis of the Democratic Party in particular during the period of the Democratic Party's hegemony. It was resolved in such a way as to have the Dixiecrats join the Republicans, etc. But there was a moment, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, that stuff, that was a moment. And if the Democratic Party had been smashed, that would have, Bonapartism is fragile. It would have potentially undermined the U.S. state. And so there were, revolutionary possibilities that we wouldn't want to overplay, but they existed. And they can't be chalked up to an economic crisis, like to the political economic crisis of capitalism traditionally understood. And that's why the neo-Marxist turn of the '60s had the character that it did, where they tried to get into the deeper structures of capital and this kind of thing. It was authentically motivated. It was real. Dario.
So I was wondering if you can speak to two things which are interrelated. So James brought up the old left, and basically in the sense of the narrative that you have, you're underplaying the role that they played in this period. But I want you to speak to the actually existing socialist states and the role that they played, not only through like Moscow Gold funding of certain communist parties, but also in direct solidarity efforts. For instance, in the DDR, during the 1980s in a miners' strike in Britain, there was, the official trade unions had drives to collect money to send over to the miners to help them in that strike, and efforts like this, and the phenomenon of, as the old union bosses in West Germany used to say, the DDR sat at the table with us. So the actual, simply the existence of the Socialist East and the role that this played in the left politics in the West, and related to this, how the integration, the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the integration of a lot of the old parties into the new European left, of which things like D-Link directly and other formations like this in Europe are a direct product of. Because I think that there's, in this case, uniquely European experience where the situation is somewhat more complex in the US, which didn't exactly have that kind of element. Like there wasn't, I mean, you know, Moscow wasn't, or the actually existing socialist state were not able to play the part that they did in the United States as they did in Europe.
Okay. I think one of the things about the 70s and 80s is that one is speaking about chronological periods, but also types. So I push for the 80s because I'm not thinking just of a particular historical period, because I wanted to speak about a broader phenomenon. One of the things that happened, a simple way of viewing this, is that the 70s lasted longer in Europe, in a way up to 89 in many places, than they did in the United States. And I guess Britain was closest to the United States of all the European countries. And a large part of that is the United States was a lot further from the Soviet Union, both geographically and politically, and that certain processes could happen here less impeded by the existence of the old left, by the Soviet Union, etc. And so everything you say about the existence of the Soviet Union, I all agree with, but I think like in retrospect, what we're focusing on is the term. It's the ways in which the 80s would have differed from the 70s, because those are what have lasted, rather than things that in many cases survived into the 80s. And I think part of the appeal of French theory actually had to do with the ways in which the French left was very different from the American left. And in some ways, because France was, I will almost say, more backward in terms of its historical trajectory, there are ways in which the American left could identify with that, but deluded itself into thinking that it was more advanced.
You mean that deluded itself into thinking that the French were more advanced?
Right, that they were more sophisticated, etc. And really, what one was talking about was phenomena that happened because
like a lag phenomenon.
It was a lag phenomenon because, yes, there are obvious sociological and political differences between Europe, and what's actually happened in the last 20 years or so is one sees how those have greatly diminished. They were still much greater in the 80s than they are now, I would say. And they will probably be less so in the future.
I mean, the interesting thing about the lag phenomenon is probably more people are reading Foucault, even proportionally, not just in absolute terms, in the United States than in France. So.
Right, but that speaks to the Americanization of Foucault. I mean, in other words, it's not like there's a way in which, French theory. I mean, I read an article about how, lots of these French theorists were sort of forgotten or downplayed in France until people discovered a lot of these people are buried over earning huge salaries. California, it's like, oh, the Americans are paying them a lot of money, they must be important, maybe we should read them.
Good. All right, so the question of official communism, it's come up twice now. Yeah, it does push to the limits of how I was characterizing the 80s. I think that's something that Richard mentioned earlier needs to be borne in mind with respect to official communism, and that's Maoism. And so I think that, rather than give in to a kind of Trotskyist bias with respect to these matters, we would have to sort of admit that, on the one hand, Maoism is a new left phenomenon.
Which is more important in the United States and France than Britain.
It's pretty important in France.
In France and the United States, rather than Britain.
Rather than Britain, yeah. On the one hand. On the other hand, it clearly is the way in which the old left renovated itself. Meaning, what I brought up earlier about the Popular Front politics, that Maoism rejuvenates popular front politics, the mass line, this kind of thing. And that takes a variety of forms. It takes the form of community activism, it takes the form of how they participate in the labor movement. It has, manifold effects. In terms of the actual effect of the existence of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, the East Bloc, in terms of social democratic or Euro-communist politics, Euro-communism is another tricky phenomenon. I feel like it's a vintage 70s phenomenon that carries over into the 80s, but it's really, has its energy in the 70s. It doesn't really have its energy in the 80s. It goes to whether the Soviet Union and the East Bloc was in crisis already in the 70s. I think that it was. And so I think that needs to be taken into consideration. And that's where Maoism plays a peculiar role, because there's a way in which Maoism already acknowledges that. Not simply in terms of the Sino-Soviet split, but also in terms of the Cultural Revolution, and more importantly, in certain respects, in terms of the rapprochement with the US in the context of détente in the 70s. And so it's kind of a curious thing. In other words, in the 70s was, the People's Republic of China to the left of the Soviet Union, or was the Soviet Union to the left of the People's Republic of China? Right? You can make claims in either direction, in fact. And I think that, again, this plays out because the United States has a much weaker official communist movement. What it means is that the split to Maoism is also of a different character here. There are former Moscow line Stalinists who become Maoists. There are some of those, but really there's a kind of wholly new kind of Maoism in the 70s. And I'm not sure about the history of that with respect to France, for example. There's just new left.
It's kind of youth splits from the CP.
It's youth splits.
Like the UJCML and stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay, so it's youth splits. So it's almost like the SDS in Germany or something. It's extra parliamentary opposition.
We had both in both, but I mean, you just had
Not
a large.
in the US.
You had, the difference was, the thing is, you just had a larger culture of Stalinism, official communism that permeated a much larger segment of society.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah, but I think that I was leaving aside, this is probably part of what Richard mentioned earlier, my downplaying of 1989. I tend to downplay 1989 as a phenomenon. And therefore, tend to downplay.
Which is curious, because in the first talk that you gave, you were actually pointing out in some sense the Spartacist view of this as yet another world history.
That was Richard.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That was Richard. Yeah.
Okay.
And in other words, I
We've
would.
known triloquize each other so successfully.
No, the reason for this, and I'll just sort of admit this, is that I don't think 1989 was such a phenomenon of the left. I think it's a phenomenon of the right. Meaning that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the new left getting what it wanted, but not as a result of its own activity.
Yeah.
Can I just make one, what I find most interesting about that is that the Spartacist League itself, paradoxically, in its own way, bizarrely downplays 1989. Because in terms of its own narrative, 1989 should be the most important thing that ever happened in the world during the existence of the Spartacist League. But there's a way in which if they thought about that, they might have to question their whole raison d'etre. Because it represents what in their own narrative has to be an incredibly profound defeat, and yet they just kind of basically go on as though it's still the 80s. I mean, that's the weird thing about the Spartacist League, and that's why they have such a weird quality to them. That they don't acknowledge what, from their own theoretical perspective,
Should have been huge.
should have been huge.
See, the reason that I avoid 89, and since the topic of my talk is the 80s, I suppose that I have to address 89. The reason that I avoid 89 is that I think that, and it's also the reason why the Cliffites are, we have various sort of number one enemies. Right? On the one hand, the Cliffites are the number one enemy. On the other hand, maybe they're not. Maybe it's like endnotes and that kind of scene, right? Compensation theory, right? And so, but the degree to which the Cliffites are the number one enemy, then it has to be, we'd have to distinguish the idea that our project is facilitated by the collapse of the Soviet Union. In other words, if the collapse of the Soviet Union frees the world to be Marxist again, right? And this might be a difference, right? It might be a difference in our default sensibilities among us, sort of senior members. I like to think of Platypus as being facilitated by not the collapse of Stalinism, but rather the collapse of the New Left, which is a different thing. And I think that the crisis of the New Left, the long kind of dead hand of the New Left, kind of loosening its grip, right, is something that happens just when Platypus happens, meaning it's, you know, less than 10 years old. And it's the failure of the anti-war movement. In other words, why we saw the failure of the anti-war movement as an opportunity in a way that the Seattle failure, because it was a failure, was not an opportunity, is because it was the comeback of a certain kind of Marxism, and yet it was the clear failure of that kind of Marxism. And so I tend to downplay 89 because I don't want to think Platypus is facilitated by the collapse of Stalinism. I want to think that we're facilitated by a much more recent phenomenon. Cam?
I guess I'll try to keep this short because we're running so far
Yes.
behind. And I'm also kind of wary of how to phrase this because I might sound like a fanatic trying to demonstrate the unconscious unity of his body when you don't know that there's a problem. But I'm going to do it anyhow, so I will. I think when you bring Eurocommunism into this, I don't think it actually problematizes this formulation we have at all.
Okay.
I think it actually, you know, the way Eurocommunism goes in the 80s, and you know, they were really into the idea of post-Fordism, as James Woodhausen pointed out in our panel, because it was writing off the working class in favor of like these new agents, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like, so,
Gramsciism.
yeah, and it exactly becomes the logic behind like neoliberal multiculturalism, and you know, through its appeal of feminism and so on, also the sort of like authoritarian neoliberalism of New Labor, and their obsession with like controlling personal behavior.
That's where I see New Labor as actually having roots in 70s liberalism. Right.
Well, yeah, but it has to be said that a big part of the core team of Blairism were former Eurocommunists. So Peter Mandelson, Jack Straw was around them, but in Labour, very certain fact.
And that's the thing, right?
Like,
Like,
at least people.
the Eurocommunists win. What goes on of the Communist Party of Great Britain are these are marginal activist groups, you know, like no offense intended, but I mean, you know, the people behind Marxism today, who published their last issue with like an egg on Marx's face, they succeed. I think their project does, you know, to some extent do what.
And that's an 80s, you would say. That's
I would think so.
Yeah, I mean, just clarification, Martin Jakes takes over editorship of Marxism Today in 1979, and that's the next 10 years is the high period of all this post-Fordism and
Nate, and then that'll be the last question.
Sure. I mean, pretty short. I mean, just kind of like a comment. I mean, actually, in terms of throughout the talk, I was thinking a lot in terms of actually the panel last night, the closing plenaries. I mean, not so much in terms of what, you know, might be sort of more external dimension of that, but the internal one.
We had 360 generation people on
Exactly. No, exactly. Like there was Aaron, because there was Aaron from EndNotes, EndNotes Collective, and then, you know, and et cetera. And I mean, I felt that both what we were able to, the way that we were able to shake up Bronner and Ginden, and actually brought certain very insightful points out of them, was good and telling. And especially when like Ginden basically kind of like a somewhat, it was a good general point, but also kind of like I think like kind of like an implicit critique of Rashid, which was that, you know, that like the problem of like pandering to the youth, you know, which is how this like bad dynamic of activism and academicism plays out in the 80s. You know, in other words, it's the new left, this kind of like older new left generation.
Oh, the kids are all right.
Oh yeah, seeding sort of.
We definitely disagree.
What's that?
The kids are all right.
Yeah.
We definitely disagree.
Right, and you know, and I mean, it also to my mind really like hammered in the point where it's like, you know, we have like nothing to learn from like EndNotes, unlike the older generations.
Well, it's an interesting thing though, because I was telling, you know, because Richard was saying after the panel last night, Richard was saying that as much as he may have disagreed with Roger Rashi, Sanjinden, and Stephen Eric Bronner, he still felt like he was speaking their language.
Yeah.
Whereas with Aaron, he felt like he didn't understand what he was talking about. And I was like, yeah, but that's the future.
It is
Right.
our generation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
People in their 20s and
Or
early
slightly
30s.
older.
it's older,
Honestly.
90s.
But that's also like Budgen and Bastiles and like all these people in a certain sense. They're
Bastiles
also
is
different.
my age, Budgen's 10 years younger.
Oh yeah, not yet, but like, right, not Bastiles, but so like.
I hate
you know,
to do
that's-
this generational fetishism, but it actually does matter.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really unfortunate that it matters, but it does. Because what it has to do with is just contingent factors, like what you happen to be exposed to at a certain age when you're still open to ideas, and then you just sort
Also,
of,
who teaches you when you're an undergrad?
or the 80s generation.
Can I ask a question about, I mean, one of the things that's happened is that higher education, especially with academicism, particularly in the United States and other big speed of Europe, has changed sociologically. The cost of education is becoming more elitist again, I mean, in many ways. And it's becoming more professionalized. So the question is, like, what is the long-term trajectory for any kind of academic left? Like in 10, 20 years, will
I
there
don't
be-
think that our generation will sustain it. Like, in other words, I think that the 60s generation is also the last generation of academic leftists. That already our generation, the way it sustains academic leftism is already something wholly different. You know, you get it in the Bastiles like encounter. You don't get it so much with the Jody Dean. That's like a stranger phenomenon. But with Bastiles, where he's like, well, all these Marxists complain about Badiou not being a Marxist, but Badiou, says he's not a Marxist, and so what are you guys talking about, right? It's not Marxism anymore. That's right. It's not Marxism anymore. Next, right? And I feel like that we have to pay attention to that.
Also
Not out of the fetishism of Marxism, but what that represents historically.
But also in a weird way too, Aaron, I mean, like, at one point, I thought it was, like, really telling, where he was like, okay, like, we have to, like, do all this stuff, and, like, we have to, like, be involved in all these struggles, so that we can produce class analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, so you need to, like, be involved in these struggles and everything, so that you can then, like, write, like, shit that academic, like, leftists who were completely, like, isolated, like, did in the 80s, basically.
Well,
But there's a
what
way
I've
which
heard
it's-
is Endnotes, might seem like an obscure zine here in the United States, but in Britain it has a wide readership among students.
It does, absolutely. All of our alumnus contacts know about Endnotes.
Yeah, which is really unfortunate, but anyway.
To Richard's point, I wonder, like, just thinking about the generational experience of the past 10 years, I mean, SDS was a student phenomenon. Occupy was a drop out of school phenomenon.
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe like student activism is like
Although in
a
Occupy,
phenomenon that is actually fading, and then what does that leave in terms of a locus? I mean, I'm just curious, like, so in that sense, like one might have like only the activist part left.
I think that we'll be dealing with this configuration of academicism and activism. That's not going to go anywhere right away. It might degrade, but it's not going to disappear. Okay, so let's adjourn this session and then take a brief break, just a bathroom break, and then come back for the organizational meeting.